In a previous lecture, we took a look at visual hierarchy in web design and talked it from a more pragmatic sense, in which we talked about using rows and columns and size, proximity, white space, and a lot of different things. And I showed examples of how these were used well or how they were used poorly in a variety of websites. Now that you have that basis to understand what it looks like, what we're talking about, this idea of visual hierarchy, I want to introduce you to the more academic or artistic side of this, and we are going to now talk about Gestalt theory. So we've talked visual hierarchy, but we haven't really looked at this principle behind it. Why do all those things work? So essentially, Gestalt is a German word that means a unified whole. It's a set of psychological principles that a set of psychologists came up with in order to explain how people perceive things, how they perceive objects, what makes them consider a set of objects to be together or apart. So how are we organizing and interpreting information in our head? So essentially, this theory is trying to explain how humans organize and interpret visual information. And we use this from a very then practical sense to try to understand how we should place things in, let's say, a work of art, or in a book design cover, or on a website. How do we help a human who's looking at our creation to perceive the patterns that we want them to perceive? All right, so I want you to kind of imagine it as the way our brains like to see things, because we have this natural inclination to focus on details. And with Gestalt theory, it's kind of like looking at a big picture first, and then once we've looked at this big picture, we try to make sense of what parts of the picture go together, so that there is not a sense of overall chaos, that we are able to see some type of pattern that's there. We could also use this understanding of how the brain perceives, again, to make things such as a website more compelling. When we design websites, we can use Gestalt theory to help create it so that it will immediately grab the attention of the user, that they want to look at this, that they will understand the message within 2 seconds, and that it's pleasing to the eye for whatever our message is. So, last thing I want to mention, and probably a phrase that you'll hear most with Gestalt theory, is that a design as a whole, the whole design, 100% of the design, is different than if we look at each part separately. So this means that when I look at a design, I'm not just focusing immediately on the small details. Let's say I'm looking at a picture of a face. I'm going to first of all look at the entire face, and I see it as a whole, and only after I understand it as a whole do I start to look at some of the details and begin to group things together. So perhaps I will group the eyes together. There's a similarity to them. And then I'll group let's say the brown strokes around the head, and I'll identify those as hair. And if I just looked at the hair alone, or if I just looked at the brown strokes alone, I might not recognize them as hair potentially. But when I see it as a whole on top of a face, then I understand it all together. All right, there are 3 Gestalt applications for web design that I want to talk about in this video. I want to talk about proximity, so putting things close together. I want to talk about similarity, making things look alike, and continuity. And you'll recognize that the word proximity, similarity, you'll recognize we talked about these ideas earlier with visual hierarchy, but again, we just had not talked about this in terms of Gestalt theory and the various Gestalt laws. Now, there are more than three. These are just the three that I want to focus on. So first of all, the Gestalt law of proximity. So essentially, objects that are close together seem like they belong together. So size, shape, and the type of object doesn't matter as much as the proximity. It's those things being close together that helps us feel like this is a group as opposed to disparate parts. So when it comes to web design, we want to put items together closely that we want to have go together. So let's say I have a call to action button saying, like a click here. And I want it to be close to by whatever they're going to discover if they're clicking here. Let's say, for instance, somebody is making a portfolio of their own design work. And so perhaps we have a photo that says portfolio over the top of it, and then we have a call to action button right next to it or right below it that says click here. So those things we would see, because they're placed very closely together, they go together. It makes sense. Our user doesn't have to think about it. So we want to be very careful about how we put objects in a proximity. So if we don't want people to think that they're together as a grouping, if they're unrelated, we don't place them close together. So let's say here I just have a very basic design with a bunch of circles here, and because it's just random, we don't really seem to have a good grouping here. They all kind of seem to be their own individual parts. Maybe, it just doesn't seem to go together. So if I had something like this on a website, and I had, let's say, words or a little picture in each of these circles, then I would be giving a visual cue that these are all unrelated aspects, that they don't relate to each other. Now, if I take those same circles and put them in a way that's related, suddenly, instead of these just being 9 circles, we have one shape here. So here, 9 different shapes. Here we have one shape of a box full of circles. So this is, again, just how we are going to think about using proximity. So to give you an example of the law of proximity in web design, I pulled up eBay. Now, eBay is a site that has tons and tons of stuff, and so you will see that they will put things close in proximity that are similar to each other. So if we look at the photos about halfway down here, in which we have the tennis shoes, and with these shoes, they're all in close proximity to each other, and you notice there is space between the shoes and the banner ad that's above it and the set of photos that are below it as well. So it's that proximity that tells us these are all related. And although we still have circles below, we know that they're different because they have been moved away from the shoes. So we have used this law of proximity to immediately, clearly let the user know this top row is connected, this bottom row is connected, and that helps us to just easily find what we want. So the takeaway here, proximity in design will help elements feel connected and unified so our users don't have to work. We want to make things as easy as possible for whoever is going to be using our website. Next, let's talk about the Gestalt law of similarity. So, people will perceive visual elements that share characteristics as belonging together. So if things have a similar shape, size, color, we are more likely to consider these things as belonging together. And so when we want to, lead our users to understand what things are together. We could use proximity, like we just talked about, or we could use similarity, or we could use both of them together. So that eBay page, instead of having the bottom row of circles, they could have made that squares if they had wanted to, made it a slightly different shape. But they didn't. They decided not to. They thought the proximity was enough. And it probably was in that case, but it's just something for us to think about. So using another very basic design, here I have a set of circles, and again, kind of random. We have some different colors here, but because they're kind of randomly here, they're not placed well, we don't really see them as related. But if I do this and I place them here, now instead of seeing 9 random circles, I now see this green that, even though it's different sizes, that green, that color, helps us to see that as a whole. And then we have kind of the rust and the mustard as a whole. So we have these rows here. And again, it's just easy to help our users to understand what's happening on our website without having to work at it too hard. And so for this one, I brought in Etsy, because Etsy did a little bit more variation than what we saw on eBay. And so we see at the top we have a row, the shops we think you'll love, and you'll see we have boxes with 4 rectangles in each of the 3 boxes at the top. And so that's different, but there's that similarity between we have the box 1, 2, 3, and they're similar because they have the 4 rectangles in each box. If we go down a row, now no longer do we have 4 boxes or 4 rectangles in each box. We now just have a rectangle for one item. And so it's showing me things that I've looked at recently, some things that I may have bought, and we're showing that all of those are now laid out and have the same size. So they're similar. And then we go down below, and they've now chosen a new style to separate this from the other ones above. So now if we scroll down, we would see that 3rd row, they're taller photos as opposed to being more of the landscape that the middle row is. So they're using sizes in different ways to help you understand how things are grouped together. And that makes it just very easy for users to see what's going on. The 3rd law is the law of continuation. And this one we really didn't talk about in the previous video, so this might be the most confusing one to understand. But the Gestalt law of continuation says that when people's eyes will naturally follow a path or line, we will see it as a single unbroken figure rather than separate parts. So if we see something that starts on the left and continues all the way to the end of the page on the right, that seems to us one continuous piece. We have this urge to follow lines. If something only went from the left end of a screen and it stops in the middle, then we see that as being done. And if we go below and a new line starts, then we just follow a new line. Okay, so again, this is probably kind of confusing, so let's talk about this. Okay, and I guess additionally, people perceive elements that are on a line or on a curve as more related than elements that are not on a line or a curve. So if we have, let's say we have a line and there are 3 circles along that line, if each circle is, let's say, just kind of plumb in the middle of that line, then we'll see all those circles as being a part of the line as opposed to being unrelated aspects. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to show you an example from a Subaru website that uses lines to kind of help draw the eye to their points, and they use it in a few different ways. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So what we see here is we have a line, the circle, and it goes around this area of text, and that lets us see all that text. But then as we have this start exploring, we have what looks like a tree ring, and there's a timeline with this, and you can click on different parts of the timeline to find out different facts. And so because we see all of these elements on a timeline, let me just go back to that real quick. Because we see all of these on a timeline, they are related. Whereas if they were just, kind of, if this was here and it wasn't connected to this line, and this one just kind of showed up out here, they would just seem random and they wouldn't have the same impact as being all together. Here it has more impact. And then as we finish up with this tree ring, you see we have another line here. And like I mentioned, with this law of this idea of completion, our eye likes to follow things all the way through. So we start here, and it's ending here, but now the line's going to keep moving and drawing us in. So we keep looking because we feel some type of compulsion to keep looking and not to just break off. And so there's one good example of how a website has used this law of completion. And hopefully you understand a little bit better now what this idea means. Let's next take a look at something that you don't want to do. How does this law of continuation, and you'll also hear me sometimes calling it the law of completeness, these both kind of that our eye wants to complete that line, wants to continuing following that line. Here's an example of how to use that in a way that is helpful for users. So with this particular announcement for a sale, what they would like you to read is special sale Black Friday. And the person who designed it thinks because we have the two first words in red that law of similarity is going to help people to know that those two words go together. And because we have Black and Friday in the black type here, that people will automatically understand that those go together. But when we throw in the law of continuation, what we know is that people like to read things in a line to follow that natural line. And because we read from left to right and top to bottom in English, then what a user is more likely to read is special Black sale Friday. We don't want that. So the law of continuation will help us know not to make this mistake. Instead, we should have it look something like this: special sale Black Friday, because the law of continuation helps us to follow this in the very natural line that we're used to reading in. Now let's talk about how this can be used in web design. And there are two major things that I wanted to bring up when it comes to the law of continuation. One is talking about navigation buttons. How can we use continuation to try to encourage people to click on something that we have? So we want to figure out how we can use this in that. And there's also something called the Z pattern, which is a pattern, a way that we can design a website to make it very easy for people to continue the line and read an entire page. I have an example from a website here, and you're going to see how they're using this law of continuation to kind of encourage you to watch what's happening, to be interested, to continue to watch it. And they use it in a few ways. It starts out with a little animation here, and then we pop up to here. And you'll notice that on the one hand, it starts out with this kind of circle that we watch as it's fully done. And then we go into the web page here, and they have some more things here. So we have a navigation button here, and we have a line around it which has drawn attention to it, and so we could click there. We also have another navigation button here, and this helps us to know that there is something below this particular part of the website. And so here they're using the law of continuation, both in that first part, and let's do it one more time. Let's watch it one more time so we can see it all together, because this is all from the same website. So we'll play it. There we go. So you see the few different ways we use continuation, and it kind of makes you curious to see what's next. Another example of continuation comes from a UI school, and so I didn't turn the sound on this, by the way, so we'll hear it silently because I wanted to talk about it. So this is where you can do online lessons to learn more about UI design. I've never used any of their programs. I just thought the website was interesting, and so just so you know, I don't endorse it or something. It's just one that I happened to come across and thought was good for this lesson. All right, so let's see how they use the law of continuation. All right, so you see things are moving. We're curious, we're looking, we're seeing what's happening, what's going on with all these shapes and movements, and we want to continue to look at it. We want to see what's going to happen. And they've also used navigation button here as well. So you can see, if you look in this far right hand column here, that they've used that to help you know that you can continue to go down. And they do have stuff that's below that. I just happened to stop it there. But I thought those were good examples of how you could use this Gestalt principle in a website. Next, let's take a look at Z patterns. Here's an example of how the Z pattern works on a mock web page. So here we have this set up, and we expect people to enter in the top left-hand corner, read across on the menu bar, and the most important part of your menu bar, where you want people to take action, should be on this far right side. Then, after we're there, we then want to draw the eye down in a diagonal to the other side of the page. And here we use a headline, subheads, or some type of something that would draw attention down to here. And once we do that, then we are going to lead people in finishing out this Z pattern by following to the far right. And this is where our most important action button should happen, because this is what we want, the last thing that people see on this part of our landing page, and we want them to do something about it. And also notice, since we're talking about the Gestalt principle of continuity, we have a little arrow here to help draw people's attention to an important aspect. So this is an example of how you could use the Gestalt law of continuity in your website design. While there are other Gestalt laws, there are the three that we've just talked about in this lecture that I want you to think the most about. Use proximity, similarity, and continuity when creating your website. And I want to reassure you that using Gestalt principles is something that anyone can do. I think it might be a little scary to try to use something that has a German name to it, such as Gestalt laws or Gestalt principles, but really, it's not that hard. And I think it's like you have the secret weapon that is right at your fingertips, that you can design things that can be clearly understood by your users just by understanding the natural way that brains perceive and process information. And so you're designing understanding just this little tiny piece of psychology. And you'll immediately be able to design better than you did before understanding these basic Gestalt principles. So leverage this knowledge, create designs that will be effective for your users, and encourage them to understand and interact with the content on your website. I know your professor is really looking forward to seeing the kind of work that you're going to do on your website design. So go for it and design with confidence.